Recently, I've been on the hunt to find new game engines. In the past, I've tried out Microsoft's game engine, and I recently revisited Scratch after over a year. In this video, I'll be trying out Godot for the first time to see if it's any good. The first thing I did was download Godot. After downloading it, I exported it and opened it up for the first time. But I didn't know how to make a game with Godot yet, so I went onto YouTube and searched up Godot tutorials. I got an overwhelming results of tutorials, but none of them really stuck out to me, so I decided to use Godot's learning tool on their website. Since it's my first time using Godot, I took their Make Your First 2D Game tutorial. First, I downloaded the assets. After downloading the assets, I made my first Godot project. Next, I went to the project settings and set the screen width to 480 and set the screen height to 720. And I set the stretch mode to canvas items. With the project fully set up, I imported the game assets. Then I made a new area 2D node for the player and gave it an animated sprite body. After, I made the player animation states and gave it a collision shape 2D. Next, I changed the collision shape to capsule and resized it to fit the player. With the player animations and collision shapes done, I made a new script for the player. In the script, I made a new speed variable and set it to 400. After, I made a new screen size variable. Then, I set the screen size variable to the game screen size. In addition, I made input actions to detect different input for the player movement. Next, I made the player movement script and made it play animations depending on what it's doing. With the player movement done, I hit the player when the game starts and made a new hit signal. After, I made a function for when the player joins the game, and I made the player hide when it gets hit, and I disabled the collision after it gets hit. Lastly, I made a start function for the player. Now that the player is done, I made a new scene and added the rigid body 2D to it and renamed it to mob. After, I added an animated sprite 2D, a collision shape 2D, and a visible on-screen notifier. Next, I made the enemy animations. Then, I made a new script for the enemy, and I made the enemy pick one of its 3 animations when it spawns for more variety, and when the enemy goes off the screen, I deleted it. After, I made a new scene and added a user interface to it. Next, I renamed the user interface to main and gave it a mob timer, score timer, start timer, and finally I gave it a marker 2D and renamed it to start position. Then I set up all the timers and set the start position's position. Additionally, I added a path 2D node, renamed it to mob, and set it up. After setting up the path 2D node, I added a path follow 2D node and renamed it to mob spawn location. Next, I added the player node into the main scene, and I made a new script in the main scene and made a variable to get the mob scene. Furthermore, I made a new score variable, and I connected the mob scene to the variable. After, I connected the player hit method to the game over method. In the game over method, I stopped the score timer and the mob timer. Additionally, I made a new method for when the game starts. In this method, I set the score variable to 0, I set the player's position to the start position marker, and I started the start timer. Next, I made an on mob timer timeout method, an on score timeout method, and an on start timer method. In the score timeout method, I added 1 to the score, and in the on start method, I started the mob and the score timers. And in the on mob timeout method, I made a mob variable and set it to the mob scene.instantiate. Then I made a new variable for the mob spawn location and set it to the mob spawn location. Next, I set the mob spawn location.progress ratio to a random float. Additionally, I made a direction variable and set it to the mob spawn location's rotation plus pi divided by 2. Then I set the mob spawn location to the mob spawn location.position. After, I added a random range of -pi divided by 4 to pi divided by 4 to the direction variable. Next, I set the mob's rotation to direction. Furthermore, I made the mob actually move. Finally, I added the mob child. Next, I made the ready function and made it call the new game function. But I already had a ready function, so I called the new game function in the first ready function and deleted the second one. After, I closed the bracket for when I started the mob timer, and I tested out the game. Now the enemy spawns and the player spawns in the right place, but the player only moves once when the input is pressed. So I fixed that by getting rid of the just in the player's movement if statements. Now the player moves as long as the input is pressed. Another issue in the game is the enemy wouldn't get deleted when they go off screen. This was because I forgot to connect its screen exited to the visible on screen exited function. Now when the enemy goes off screen, it gets deleted. The last issue I had was the player wouldn't be deleted when it collided with a mob. This was a pretty easy fix because all I had to do was connect the body entered function to the on body entered function. Now whenever the player gets hit, it gets deleted. Making the UI took me a while for some reason, so here's just a time lapse of what I did. After making the UI, I was thinking of adding a different background to the game. My idea was for it to have a sky background, but after putting the blue background, I realized that I liked how it looked already. The final step was for me to add some sound effects. First, I added 2 Sound Stream Player 2D nodes, and I renamed them to Death Sound and Music. Then I set up the nodes. Additionally, I started playing the music when the game started, and I played the death sound when the player died. That's it for the development of my first ever Godot game. Here's the final result. That's it for this video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notifications to get notified when I upload a new video. See ya!